Welcome to the Politismos Museum of Greek History online lecture series. With a 21st century online format, Politismos is proud to provide visitors the chance to explore Greek history and culture from the comfort of their computer, tablet, and even smartphone. This lecture is presented by historian Peter Giakoumis, the Vice President of Byzantine Crown Productions, a history-based production group that promotes accurate portrayal of Hellenic culture in their projects. He is a military historian, lecturer, and historical consultant with over 25 years of research covering various periods of Greek history. He is an active member in the Order of Ahepa, the American Hellenic Education Progressive Association. His current work is based on the forthcoming book titled Forgotten Heroes of the Balkan Wars, Greek Americans and Philhellenes of 1912-1913. He holds a master's degree in international relations. We now present the Balkan Wars of 1912-1913 and the pioneer Greek Americans.
Studying the adventures of early Greek American pioneers and their experiences in the United States during the early 1900s is looking through a window of history that is often forgotten or overlooked. The Greek nation of pre-World War I was extremely turbulent, and prior to 1912, the Greek kingdom had suffered from economic failures. Greek men found a means to support their families by traveling to the United States. As Greek numbers grew in the United States, they brought with them a strong sense of culture. They simultaneously recognized the benefits of American life. The tangible rewards of hard work and American industry was invigorating. Most Greeks were doing well, better than in Greece, although all of them suffered from a degree of homesickness. However, by 1912, a looming war in the Balkans was slowly moving closer. Those early Greeks and pioneers were becoming Americanized Greeks by virtue of living and working in their new home. However, when the word from Greece came that their traditional homeland needed their help, they mobilized themselves in a patriotic spirit to help defend the land that had given them birth. Not only did they send money, they left the states in the thousands to fight for their traditional homeland, but never quite forgetting their adopted homeland. The American spirit was traveling with them to Greece and back in many cases. Here lies the unique story of those forgotten Greeks, Greek Americans, and Philhellenes of a bygone age. Modern Greek immigration to the United States is generally broken down into four general categories: 1890 to 1922, 1923 to 1939, and 1960 to the present. We are going to focus on the first period, specifically on the years between 1900 and 1914. That early period labels those early Greek immigrants as the pioneers of the American diaspora. Regarding the numbers of men that sailed for the United States, official sources tell us that between 1880 and 1920, 370,000 Greeks emigrated to the United States in total. We can break down those numbers between 1902 and 1911, roughly a 9-year span. A total of 241,896 Greeks arrived in the United States. By 1910, in the Intermountain states of Utah, Montana, Colorado, Wyoming, and Idaho alone, there were at least 11,000 Greek workers. Proportional numbers of Greeks appeared to have worked in California, in Oregon, and the state of Washington. The big cities like New York and Chicago became large Greek centers, boasting at least 40,000 between the two. Getting to know the United States of the 1910s gives us a better understanding of what life was like for those early Greek pioneers. First, the United States of 1912 was led by William Taft, the 27th President of the United States. His replacement was the newly elected 20th president, Woodrow Wilson. The average income was roughly $750. The average price of a new home was between $2,000 and $5,000, depending on the size and location. A new car, like a Ford Town Car, was around $800. A gallon of gas was 7 cents, and a loaf of bread was 5 cents. A dozen eggs, 34 cents, a quart of milk, 9 cents, and a stamp, 2 cents. Hellmann's mayonnaise and Oreo cookies made their debut that year. New Mexico and Arizona became the 47th and 48th states of the Union, respectively. So now we can address the question of who were those Greeks and why they left their homes and families and sailed to a far-off land without speaking the language or, for the most part, having a set skill set or trade. The majority of these early immigrants were single men who came from the southern peninsula of Greece, known as the Peloponnesus. Others came from Macedonia in the northern regions and from the Aegean and Ionian islands. Still others from Ottoman cities like Smyrna and Constantinople, which had tremendous Greek populations of their own. They left in an attempt to survive the economic chaos that controlled the Greek kingdom at the turn of the century. Many Greek families sent their sons to the United States as the only means to overcome hardship. Some of them were as young as 14, and in some cases younger. They would actually lie during their interviews or else not be allowed to enter into the shores of the United States. All of them expected to work hard in America and then return to Greece someday with the rest of all that hard-earned money that they had actually saved. So they wanted to then purchase land with that money for their family and provide dowries for their sisters before they themselves could be married, as the tradition and the custom of those times dictated. In Greece, the vast majority of these immigrants had been from rural farming areas. In America, they tended to settle in cities and urban areas and not in agriculture and rural areas per se. As for the professions, they gravitated away from agriculture as much as possible, and that was for obvious reasons. The work is tremendously hard and time-consuming, and it was based on seasons. So pay and profits were not guaranteed, and if a crop failed, so did the hope for profits. Too many factors could affect the outcome, and the money or profit was typically low in the end, especially if working for someone else. A life of farming would also take them away from others and the cities that had large numbers of fellow Greeks. So, the camaraderie that revolves around the sprouting Greek cafe and news from home in America, which was published in many Greek newspapers, was key to the community that these Greeks were putting together. Faced with those choices, almost all of them would constantly choose to work and live in the bigger city whenever possible and avoid the farms, which would cut them off from their fellow Greeks. For those reasons, early Greeks gravitated towards professions that kept them in touch with other Greeks. They threw themselves into all sorts of work. Nothing was off limits. And without true skills or trades, we find them working in most of the blue-collar manual labor positions like the lumber industry, coal mines, construction industry, railroad hands in railroad gangs, boot blacks, street peddlers, smelters, factory workers, and even sheep herders. But they also saw opportunities to be their own bosses. To work for themselves was always the most appealing to independent Greeks, so they began to save money and acquire the skills necessary to operate their own businesses, which usually meant they had to start from the bottom and work their way up to the top, and in that fashion, they became restaurant owners and operators. They did the same in other fields, and businesses such as shoe shine parlors, boarding houses, grocery stores, bakeries, florists, candy makers, ice cream parlor owners, hotel operators and owners, barbershop owners, and of course owners of coffee houses or cafes and general importers were many of the operations they ran and owned in the early 1900s. From those labors, they did well, and they sent money home for their families. As expected, those hardworking Greeks had one focus: help their families back home. From the well-known writer and professor of Greek American Studies, Professor Theodore Salutis, we learn that in 1905 alone, the Greek immigrants sent home to their families some $4 to $5 million, which grew as the years passed. And they acquired better jobs and then made more money. The year 1912 ushered in some international developments that most, if not all, Greeks, far and wide, followed very closely. The slow demise of the Ottoman Empire was slowly taking shape. Victory by the Italian nation over the Ottomans in Libya was a major sign that the time was close for the Greek nation to liberate the enslaved Greek people under Ottoman rule. Places like the Greek islands in the Aegean, the northern lands of Greece, and unification of Crete with the Greek kingdom were hot topics. The internal political turmoil and the revolution of the Young Turks within the Ottoman Empire, coupled with the denial of certain basic rights of the Greeks and other people under Ottoman rule, made war unavoidable. The Greeks of America were aware of the events and mobilized themselves accordingly. Under the guidance of a nationally founded Greek American Association, the Pan-Hellenic Union, which was established in 1907 and claimed over 100 chapters nationwide, helped to keep the Greeks in America organized and in touch with their homeland. The Greek Consul General in New York, Dimitrios Botasi, the Greek Consul in Chicago, Nicholas Salopoulos, as well as local Greek clergy with established business leaders and the leading Greek American newspapers like the Atlantis, all helped. Together they made sure that a steady flow of news from the old country made its way to every Greek in the United States, no matter how small or where the group or community was found. If the need arose, they could be informed of what actions had to be taken. As the situation got more and more perilous in the Balkans, the Greeks of America began to take notice. Their meetings consistently grew as the news of general mobilization became obvious. They realized that a good way to start off was by raising funds for their homeland. $20,000 was raised at one meeting in New York at the Amsterdam Opera House on 44th Street. 5,000 attended inside, and another 1,000 stood outside the building from the New York Times report, October 7th, 1912. Some 2,000 Greeks in Chicago, president of the Greek community, the local clergy, and prominent Greek women of Chicago lead the day and help raise over $3,000 for the Red Cross Fund from the Chicago Examiner, October 28, 1912. Greeks in the coal camps of Utah collected and sent about $8,000 to assist the Red Cross Society and help pay transportation back home for some who could not afford the expense, from the Eastern Utah Advocate dated November 7, 1912. The Atlantis newspaper followed and printed all of the contributions to the war effort. In the case of funds raised for the purchase of a new naval destroyer named the New Generation, or Nea Genia, every donation along with the person's name was listed. Even the contributor of a dime was published. The Prime Minister of Greece, Eleftherios Venizelos, had stated earlier that year that The airplane is the weapon suitable for the weaker countries. The venturesome nature of Greeks will make it a brilliant weapon, and in the future will do yeoman's service to the Greek armed forces. So the purchase of 4 aircraft had been then financed substantially by the donation of a poet named Matsoukas. He had been sent around the world to visit Greeks abroad and help raise funds. The Atlantis Greek newspaper again led the charge and promoted a separate fundraiser for the purchase of a warplane in 1912, which was then donated to the Greek army. Everything up to this point seems to lead to an actual call to arms or mobilization. The order is then given on September 30th, 1912, by royal decree. All the local Greek American newspapers as well as American newspapers carry the news. Keep in mind that Greece has not declared war. It has called for a mobilization, which is usually the step right before war is declared. You want to have your troops in place before they take the battlefield. That was exactly what the Greek kingdom was looking to do. However, many of the Greeks in America hold out for the official declaration of war. They had jobs and owned businesses, had to make preparations. It was difficult to drop everything and go, especially since war had not been declared. Many of the men decided to start packing in anticipation of all-out war. Many of the Greeks who did not serve in the military or came from areas that were still held by Ottoman Empire had no obligation to do everything or anything in terms or in regards to returning to fight. But as we shall see, thousands did anyway, including non-Greeks. By now, the Greek embassy, Washington, D.C., October 2nd, 1912, there's a release and it says, "Please communicate to Greek subjects and newspapers the following telegram concerning mobilization of the Greek army. Order published September 30th at 12 o'clock midnight and called soldiers into service. All Greeks who are now in the United States and who have served in the Greek Army and Navy from 1896 to 1911 to return to Greece." It is said that between 7,000 and 8,000 Greeks in Utah will leave. And this was probably as important in a change in their numbers. It is said that between 7,000 and 8,000 Greeks in Utah will leave. And this will probably mean an important change in their numbers here, according to the Salt Lake Telegram dated October 4th, 1917. Groups of Greeks prepare for the call while others pack their bags. Greek consul Theodore Siaklos announces on October 8th, 1912, that 7,000 Greeks from Montana, Idaho, and Wyoming are waiting for the word to start their trip back to Greece to fight in the war. 2,000 Greeks ready to go from Colorado within a week once called. Other Greeks take to the road and begin the journey back to Greece. 400 men from Nashua, New Hampshire leave for the war. A second wave of 300 Greeks kneel to pray before leaving Davenport, Iowa for the fight against the Turk. First, a group was made up of 500 Greeks and 140 Bulgarians, taking with them $30,000 US. Quite a number of Greeks leave Mason City, Iowa, doting first call to war. 10 Greeks leave Quincy, Illinois by train, given half-price train tickets. 100 Greek businessmen leave Los Angeles on a special train for the war. The train stops in Salt Lake City, Denver, Kansas City, Chicago, and Buffalo to pick up others. 68 Carbon County, Pennsylvania Greeks from the coal mines leave for New York to join the war. 2 coaches and a baggage car are set aside for their accommodations. Over 200 Greeks leave Utah. 9 Greeks leave from Fort Collins, Colorado for the war. 65 Greeks leave Oak Creek, Denver for Old Country. 400 Greeks from Milwaukee are bivouacked in Chicago overnight, heading for New York for the trip home and the war. Nearly half of the men were in uniform and are all prepared for active service according to the report in the Salt Lake Telegram dated October 14, 1912. The 400 mentioned above is actually broken down as such. 200 American Greeks from Milwaukee were led by a chief officer, Demetrios Vasquez. His actual rank is unknown. The other 200 American Greeks were from Chicago and led by a Lieutenant Konstantopoulos, reserve officer of the Greek army, according to a news article dated October 19, 1912. Another 300 Greek Milwaukeeans arrived for duty, led by Dr. Koundanis, a reserve lieutenant arriving in Chicago, ready to ship out for the war in Greece. Mr. George Matalas of Chicago, a salesman of Albert and Pick Company, a reserve artillery lieutenant in the Hellenic Army, takes off for the war. 250 Greeks arrive in Erie Station, New Jersey, on board a special train from San Francisco. They disembarked and fell into formation 4 abreast and marched to the ferry boat which took them to Lower Manhattan for the trip to Greece. The detachment was accompanied by a man in Greek naval uniform and commanded by Gus Stamatas, a former sergeant in the Greek army, and former corporal in the California Volunteers, and had 6 years of service in the Philippines, according to the New York Times article dated October 29, 1912. Turns out that a local San Francisco military supply store had actually outfitted those volunteers in the kit of the American soldier of those times. Let's keep in mind that traveling to Greece was no small accomplishment. It was done exclusively by ship. In 1912, the trip to Greece took 3 to 4 weeks. It was a transatlantic voyage with cost approximately $40 US. But to gain a better perspective on how much that actually is, imagine that in 1912, $3 is worth $66.17 in 2007, using the Consumer Price Index. So, $49.50 in 1912 is actually worth $1,091.85 in 2007. So not only were the Greeks of America mobilizing, but many Philhellenes, or friends of Greece, took action. One of them is the most accomplished individual American to participate in the Balkan War under the Greek flag. His name is Colonel Thomas Setzer Hutchison. He was a former brigadier general in the Tennessee National Guard and held many positions in the United States Army, politics, and in state service prior to embarking on his adventure in the Greek army. He had been appointed by the governor of Tennessee as the commissary general of the state. The mayor of Nashville had appointed him one of the police commissioners of the city. An active member of the Progressive Party, he was also a great friend of former U.S. President Colonel Theodore Roosevelt of the Rough Riders. He became interested in the wars of Europe, and after meeting with numbers of Greek volunteers in New York City, he was convinced to go to Greece and volunteer his services in the Greek kingdom. Once he arrived in Athens, he presented himself to the premier of Greece, Eleftherios Venizelos, and was commissioned a major in the Greek army. He was assigned to the Garibaldi Legion or Corps and saw combat at the Battle of Pisani. He was wounded in battle and was later honorably discharged. He kept a diary during his trip and wrote a first-hand account of his experience, which was published upon his return to the United States with the help of local Greek Americans in the community of Nashville, Tennessee. The name of the book is An American Soldier Under the Greek Flag at Bygone, published in 1913. Because of the detailed observations that he made and documented, we are forever indebted and today privileged to have his account, which is the only contemporary account published in English by an American combatant. Upon his return and recovery from his wounds, Colonel Hutchison continued his close ties with the Greek Americans throughout the United States. He wrote for various Greek American newspapers and gave lectures on his experiences in Greece during the war. The Saloniki Greek Press, dated January 17, 1914, published an article describing one of those lectures. The article headline reads, General Thomas S. Hutchison lectures on Greece, and then continues with the following. The Greeks of Chicago, as well as many American friends, had the good fortune to attend one of the best lectures ever delivered on modern Greece and the problems she is facing, especially after the victorious Balkan Wars. The lecture was given by a long and true friend of Greece, General Thomas Hutchison, who took an active part in the Balkan Wars, fighting under our flag. The auditorium of Hull House was filled to capacity. The most prominent Greek leaders of Chicago, the clergy, educators, businessmen, and members of the professions attended this excellent presentation and timely lecture. The distinguished general and great Philhellene was warmly and enthusiastically applauded by the huge audience. The war pictures which were projected on the screen were remarkable. General Thomas Hutchison's lecture on Greece, according to the Foreign Language Press Survey. Another Philhellene that also fought for Greece, not once but twice, was General Ricotta Garibaldi. He was the commander of the Garibaldi Corps. He was the son of the famous Italian leader, the father of Italy, Giuseppe Garibaldi. He volunteered not once but twice to fight under the Greek flag, first in 1897 and then in 1912. The Garibaldi Regiment was mustered into the Hellenic Army as a light infantry regiment of approximately 2,300 soldiers. They wore red army jackets in honor of the red shirt history, which was the color of their shirts during the unification of Italy by General Giuseppe Garibaldi and his famous 1000. And it was also the color of their jackets during the Greco-Turkish War of 1897. The unit was made up of Italians, some other Southern Europeans, and over 100 naturalized Greek American citizens that had no prior military service. Therefore, the only way they could fight was by joining the Garibaldian Corps. The Garibaldian Corps distinguished itself in the Battle of Driscos, November of 1912, which is located in the region of Epirus, now considered in the northern part of Greece. The unit was decimated in the battle against superior numbers of Ottoman forces and could not continue operating as a fighting unit. The surviving soldiers, including the general, received honorable discharges from the Greek military and were allowed to return home. As the initial Greek Americans arrived in Greece, though, a curious feeling of pride and curiosity was displayed by the native Greeks of the kingdom. The International Herald Tribune in Athens, October 26, 1912, tells us the following. Greece acclaims its sons, the sacred battalion. That is the cry which greeted the contingent of Greek volunteers, 700 in number, that arrived here this evening, October 26th, from New York. It reached Patra yesterday on board the liner Madonna after 16 days at sea and came to Athens by train. The march of the volunteers to their quarters was a triumphal procession, preceded, followed, and hemmed in on both sides by an immense crowd that fell into step to the drums, the men cheering frenziedly and the women hysterical with emotion. According to General Hutchison, once he arrived in Athens and settled in a local hotel, he was stunned to see a full regiment of what appeared to be United States Army troops. The men marching in formation were dressed in regulation U.S. Army uniforms. He approached them since he was slightly shocked and discovered that they were in fact American Greeks. The troops asked him to address them in English, which he found to be surreal since there was a crowd of hundreds of Greek civilians and now reporters gathered around. Here he was, an American in Greece, addressing men in English as they stood in front of him wearing U.S. Army uniforms while he was now an officer in the Greek army. He also noticed that the men enjoyed and requested whenever possible the popular music they left behind in the States, ragtime. The American Greeks were very proud of the fact they had come from the United States, so much that they brought with them the 48-star American flag, Old Glory, as General Hutchison refers to it, and displayed it in Athens once they had landed safely and reported for duty, which for most of the New Yorkers was in full U.S. Army uniforms and weapons. Other units, too, had come to swell our army, amongst them some 400 Greeks from the United States who, on first news of war, had returned to take service. It appears that in New York, these men were allowed to form corps and to put in some elementary drill. On their collars, they bore the initials New York, from the eyewitness account written by journalist and friend of Crown Prince Constantine, Captain A.H. Trapman, in his book, The Greeks Triumphant, published in London, 1915. American Greeks form units in another newspaper headline. One such unit came from New York City. The Greek men formed an artillery battery, with all 4 of the necessary field pieces being purchased through the generosity of New York City's large Greek American population. These American Greeks were even able to purchase uniforms, equipment, and rifles from the state of New York. The New York National Guard also assisted the Greek cause by offering basic training in military discipline, hygiene, firearms, and field guns themselves to the newly formed volunteer unit. Other artillery and infantry units were formed in American Greek communities around the country, the whole of them taking on the misnomer of sacred battalions as they left for the war in the Balkans. Now, the Balkan War of 1912-1913, as chance would have it, did not last very long. Combined, they lasted less than a year, just about 9 months in total. Some of the men that returned had interesting stories that went beyond service in the Balkan Wars. For example, Mr. George Matalas, the former salesman of Albert Pick & Company and Greek Army officer, returned to Chicago with his decorations and awards on December 14, 1913, upon the conclusion of the Balkan Wars, and marries his American sweetheart, Miss Catherine Brady. On October 10, 1914, Chicago, Holy Trinity Greek Orthodox Church, 143 American Greek veterans of the Balkan Wars of 1912 and 13 were presented with medals by the official representative of King Constantine of Greece. We know the names of only 3 of them: John Agriostathos, Constantine Kolias, and Andrew Alekopoulos, all of them officers in the Greek army, and that's from the Saloniki newspaper published in the United States from a Greek press editorial dated 1914. Now, January 27th, 1914, correspondence of Mr. A. Pandelis to the members of the class of 1911 of the Marshall Law School. Mr. Koliopoulos, a fellow member of the class of 1911, has returned to this country after serving with distinction under the flag of Hellas in the late Balkan Wars. Mr. Koliopoulos was a lieutenant in the Hellenic Army prior to the Balkan Wars. He stopped his attendance at Northwestern University and left for the call to duty and fought in both of the Balkan Wars. He was promoted to captain during his service and held the distinction of being the leader of the first Greek army company to enter the city of Ioannina after the successful attack on the 19th of March, 1913. Hercules Korgis, a Greek-American hero of the U.S. Army during World War I. He had previously been a veteran of the Balkan Wars of 1912 and 1913. He earned the following U.S. and French medals during his World War I service: the Distinguished Service Cross, the Silver Star, the Médaille Militaire, the Croix de Guerre, and the Purple Heart. Korgis was a Greek immigrant who was born on the island of Mytilene in 1889. In 1903, like many young men of his generation, he left for America, settling in Lynn, Massachusetts. There he worked as a waiter, but in 1912, he volunteered, like many others, to fight in the First and Second Balkan War. He subsequently returned to the United States with 2 medals from the Greek government for heroism. When the United States entered the First World War, he immediately enlisted in 1917. While serving as a sergeant in the 23rd Infantry Regiment of the U.S. 2nd Division, he earned America's second highest decoration, a Distinguished Service Cross. During fighting near Mont Blanc, France, he was responsible for knocking out 2 German machine gun positions and killing the crew of 8 men with hand grenades. A month later, he fearlessly exposed himself to enemy fire in order to reorganize a panic-stricken unit that had been ambushed and led them in an attack upon the enemy positions. Interestingly, his most famous exploit, which only earned him the Silver Star, which is the 3rd highest U.S. award for valor, involved the capture of 256 German soldiers, including their officers. This was the biggest bag of prisoners in World War I by an American. He was dubbed a one-man army by the American press. No American soldier during the war, including the legendary Alvin York, ever equaled his feat. It happened when Korgis was shot in the neck and the leg during an attack and was subsequently captured. The German unit holding him was bypassed during the attack, but still occupied a well-defended position. Sergeant Korgis, wounded, in pain and bleeding, would still play a decisive role. With his smattering of German, Korgis was able to talk Germans into surrendering. He found some stray soldiers from his outfit and marched the Germans to a safe area in the rear. On his way to the rear with over 256 prisoners, Sergeant Korgis, covered in blood, ordered them to pick up and carry wounded Germans and Americans. When a German officer balked, Sergeant Korgis aimed his .45 automatic to his head and obtained his willing cooperation. Upon his return to the United States, he was honored by a parade down Fifth Avenue in New York City and resumed his life as a civilian, but not before completing one more task. He joined a number of Greeks and non-Greeks known as the Friends of Greece, including 50 decorated Greek-American veterans of World War I, to meet with President Woodrow Wilson in Washington, D.C., in order to solicit his aid in preventing Thrace from being apportioned to Bulgaria at the peace talks in Paris. Another great veteran that might be one of the most influential in the history of medicine was Dr. George Nicolau Papanicolaou, MD and PhD. Most women in the developed world will be familiar with the concept of a pap smear. Developed in 1923, it is the most successful screening test for cancer in history, dropping death rates by 80% in those countries with population-wide screening programs. The test was invented by Greek physiologist Dr. George Papanicolaou. But in 1912, Dr. Papanicolaou had returned to military service. He was a first lieutenant in the Greek Medical Corps. During his time in the military, he had met some Greek American soldiers who told him of the opportunities in the United States. Dr. Papanicolaou obtained a position as assistant in the Department of Anatomy in New York's Cornell Medical School in 1914, and of course later developed his screening test. The Greek Americans had done a great job fighting for their kingdom, but the American spirit would not let go. It was calling them back to the States. And this time, thousands left Greece with wives. Their next voyage was going to be the one that establishes permanent Greek-American communities. They had no intention of working for a few years and leaving again. This time, they were actually going to stay. Those veterans were the backbone behind many of the Greek-American communities that exist throughout the United States to this day. To honor those Greek-American pioneers and to help bring to life the image of those that returned to Greece in U.S. Army uniforms in 1912, I am wearing an exact replica of their uniform, with original insignia like the ones the New Yorkers wore on the battlefield in Bizani, according, of course, to Colonel Hutchison and Captain Trapman. I say to them, may the memory of those pioneers and Philhellenes be eternal.